Hola, buenos días. Reitero las gracias por esta presentación y por ver esta confluencia. Soy Bruna Álvarez y creo que podemos pasar al primer speaker. Antes, en el chat tenéis un poco de las instrucciones sobre cómo funciona todo el tema de la traducción, que, bueno, hay este botoncito, hay también los subtítulos, está todo explicado en el chat. Y para no retrasarnos más, voy ya a presentar a la persona que nos va a hacer esta ponencia. So I'm going to change to English now. It's a really big pleasure to introduce RAEWYN CONNELL, Professor Emerita at University of Sydney and life member of the National Tertiary Education Union. She has studied in several countries and is a widely cited researcher on questions of social justice, knowledge, and social transformation. She has recently been awarded in the International Sociological Association's Quadrennial Award for Excellence in Research and Practice. Her books include Ruling Class, Ruling Culture, Making the Difference, Gender and Power, Masculinities, and Southern Theory. And her more recent book is The Good University. Her work has been translated into 24 languages. RAEWYN has been active in the labor movement and in work for gender equality and for peace. And now she's going to talk about sexuality education. So it's a really big pleasure to have you here, RAEWYN. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And yeah, when you want, you can start. And again, thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you for the introduction and greetings to everyone from Sydney on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, where we're having winter at the moment, so I wish you a pleasant summer. Let me attempt a small technological feat of sharing my screen with you. I hope this is coming through okay, and now attempting to go full screen. So if all is well, I will carry on.
Perfect, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I want to talk about several aspects that come up in discussions of sexuality education. I want to talk about this as a contested field. I want to talk about what's involved in good educational practice and thought in relation to sexuality. I want to talk about its place in a broader concept of social education. And finally, I want to end up with some comments on a few professional issues for teachers in this area. So let me start then with my first moment of thought, which is that we're dealing here with a highly contested field of ideas and practices. But the first thing I really want to say is that sexuality really is a wonderful thing. I'm very much in favor of it. It's a major part of human life. It's a source of joy and connection in enormous numbers of people's lives. It's surrounded by emotion, of course, which sometimes can make it difficult and indeed a source of intimate as well as public conflict that we all know. It's important, and it's one of the conditions of human life, obviously, through the connection of much, but not all, sexuality with human reproduction, with the production and raising of children. It's in all its forms, I think, a potential source of enormous pleasure and goodwill. So it is one of our social assets. But those things that make it important, the emotion that surrounds sexuality, also make for cultural trouble. So sexuality has long been a site of cultural difficulties. Thinking back, for instance, Sigmund Freud, one of the pioneering researchers in sexuality and still an important source of ideas, was the target of an enormous amount of abuse in his lifetime, and indeed after his lifetime, for having had the boldness to argue about the importance of sexuality in human life. Same thing happened to Alfred Kinsey, a very different kind of researcher, a biologist, a quantitative surveyor, pioneering survey researcher about sexuality, who also was the subject of enormous opposition and criticism in his own life. And when we come forward to the women's liberation movement, to gay liberation, both of which had an important component of sexual liberation in their ideas, these two were the targets of a very considerable amount of backlash, partly because they dared to break familiar taboos about sexuality and its connection with the marginalization of gay, lesbian people, and indeed of those who are engaged in sexuality beyond a very narrow model of marriage. And in our time too, as you've already heard, we face a campaign developed in right-wing political and religious circles, sometimes known as the anti-gender campaign, which is against sexuality as much as it is against gender, and creates, serious difficulties for policy making and clear thinking in this area. And beyond the cultural trouble, there is, of course, material trouble in the realm of sexuality too. Sexuality is often very much at issue in gender-based violence, in forms of domestic violence. It is, of course, at issue in one way or another in rape, in child abuse, and in the more in the less spectacular forms of sexual harassment that are extremely widespread, and that very, very high proportions of women have experienced in everyday life. So sexuality is both important and troubled as an area to think in, to make policy in, to research in, and to teach in. And therefore, sexuality education can be very difficult for teachers. It is often the subject of prohibition. It is often the subject of surveillance and policing, both formal and informal. It's only a couple of generations ago, I guess my parents' generation of teachers, and both my parents were teachers, when sexual respectability was an absolute professional requirement to be a teacher in public schools in Australia. And if you were thought to have moved outside the boundaries of a very narrow sexual respectability, you would be sacked. You would not survive as a teacher. So this is not unknown in our day either. And yet, when we look at the evidence on the social relations around schools, it turns out that most parents actually approve of sexuality education in schools. Most parents want good sexuality education. They want the right information, the right understandings to be provided for their children. So although it can be a difficult area for teachers, it's also an important area for teachers to work in. And I'm absolutely in favour of both the necessary teacher training, curriculum materials and professional support to allow this to be a regular, ordinary, everyday part of the teaching work that happens in schools. Okay, now if we want good sexuality education, we need to think of what good education requires anyway. And to my mind, what good education always involves is a shift to a child-centered perspective. Education is best thought of from the bottom up, not from the top down. And here I think we're building on 100 years, even more, of educators' experience, of debate about the nature of education and the nature of learning. We've got a lot to build on there. We know that a child-centered perspective requires realism about children. It requires us to think about children as they really are, not as any cultural norm would want them to be, but as they actually are in the world. Sexuality education has been troubled for a long time by a pretense of innocence about children, a pretense that children were somehow not sexual, shouldn't be told about sexuality, that they should be protected from all of this dangerous stuff that's involved in sexuality. And all I can say about this is that such an attitude serves children very badly. It serves real children badly, whatever it may do for imaginary children. And it denies the real educational needs that exist in children's lives. It also denies what children's worlds are like, because if you eliminate or sharply constrain sexual education in the schools, you won't prevent children from getting it. It just mean that they will get it from other sources than a thought-through educational program in schools. And children have many sources for learning about sexuality. This is no secret, of course. They learn from their peers. They learn in their peer groups. That's where I got a lot of my sexuality education all those years ago. They learn about it from television. They learn about it from their families. They learn about it online. There is masses and masses of information out there, much of which will trickle through to groups of children and will trigger explorations of many different kinds. Children learn actively, and that is something I'm going to emphasize as I go on. They explore. That's natural to children's learning. They learn through relationships too. The children that we meet in school are learning gender, for instance, are learning about masculinities and femininities. Sometimes now they're also learning about other gender positions in the gender order, and are learning sexuality also in that context of learning about gender. So we're not going to stop children learning about sexuality. And the role of educators, I think, is to help them to learn well, comprehensively, and positively through ideas that are consistent with social justice, with care and respect. Now, if we're thinking of a child-centered perspective on this also, we need to think carefully about issues of readiness, of the capacities of children at different ages and from different social groups for certain parts of learning. And this is nothing new to educators. Here I'm using ideas that go back to Vygotsky, go back to Montessori, have been the ordinary, language of teacher education now for a very long time. Children's capacities and vulnerabilities change with age. We know that. So thinking about sexuality education, thinking well, we also need to think about patterns of cognitive and emotional development that affect the capacities and interests for learning at different ages. This is part of the professional task of developing appropriate curricula. And in thinking about curricula, which I will come to again, which I always think of as central to all important educational issues, we have to think about children not just as the receivers of education, but also as having resources and desires of their own. They are active agents in their own education, in the education of each other, since so much classroom learning and so much informal learning to outside classrooms is mediated through peer group relationships. Children in all their diversity then are resources for each other's learning and active agents in their own. And that, I think, is really important. Sometimes it can be difficult to bear those in mind, given the top-down traditions in sexuality education, where adults have traditionally made all the decisions. But it is useful to know that the importance of that side of children's learning and the need to incorporate that in our practices. Okay, the next theme I want to come to is the place of sexuality education in a broader concept of social education, involving issues about care and justice. Educational relationships, teacher-pupil relationships, peer-peer relationships, parent-child relationships are all sites of care. And that, of course, is an important theme of contemporary feminist thought, as Montserrat remarked earlier today. So I think it's important to think about the issues in sexuality in the light of the feminist work on the care economy, in the light of traditional assumptions about women being the workers in care work, but also in the light of men's and boys' capacities for care. So part of the task in developing good sexuality education curricula and practices is making them work both for the diverse groups of girls and the diverse groups of boys. Bringing into the picture then the changing patterns of femininity and the changing patterns of masculinity that researchers are increasingly telling us about from their work on contemporary forms of gender. Now that bears on the question of who needs sexuality education, and the obvious thing one must say is that there is no gender difference here. Girls have often been marginalized in the past in sexuality research and, of course, in many educational contexts. That is part of our history, but it's part of our history that in many ways has now been overcome. The gender differences in access to education in most parts of the world have now been overcome. And it's up to us to make the adjustments to historically received curricula that are required by a gender inclusive pupil group. Boys have to be included for good reasons too. I've argued that children and teenagers educate each other to a considerable extent. And though there may be very good social reasons for prioritizing concerns about girls in including feminist perspectives in the work, in my view, a feminist perspective also pays attention to boys. Boys are important relationally in sexual practices and gender relations, just as men are in adult sexuality and adult learning in this field. So the curricula that we develop have to be comprehensive in their relevance to different groups among the pupils. All of them have needs in sexuality education. We don't take for granted the knowledge that might be presumed to exist in any of the groups that we're dealing with. And finally, when we're thinking about social education, we're necessarily thinking about questions of justice. And by that, I mean questions that actually go beyond individual rights to the social position and needs of whole groups among the people we are hoping to educate, among the young people we are dealing with. So for instance, we need to think not only of individual responses to bullying and marginalization, but who gets bullied, who gets marginalized in school context and is thus vulnerable to abuse, which is often sexualized abuse. And there is research on this. We know something about the kinds of situations that are likely to lead to hostile dealings in a peer group context. We need to think about justice for the economically precarious in educational contexts, because the economically precarious are often also the educationally marginal, the communities whose children may find difficulty in regular attendance at schools or may lack resources that in other contexts might be assumed as aids to learning in schools, books in the home, for instance, or regular access to the internet. So we need to take account then of this particular needs, for instance, of migrant groups, of people who live in informal settlements, of the homeless, of children coming from those kinds of economically marginalized backgrounds and the kinds of needs and resources that they might bring into school education. And then finally, our educational agenda has to think about justice for the sexually abused, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of justice, of collective justice and inclusion. And that is an important way of thinking, because young people who are abused are often unappealing as objects of charity. They're often very disturbed and their lives disrupted in many kinds of ways. But it's when we think about that as an issue of social justice, one that actually affects numbers of people and in fact, creates consequences across the whole society, that we will be able to take a strong stance on that. Okay, I want to wind up my remarks by thinking about a few of the professional issues that teachers engaged in sexuality education might face. Now, I've said how important curriculum is, and I want to reinforce that here. Curriculum is, the centre of a great many educational issues and is involved in practically all educational issues. The narrow and really deeply unsatisfactory sexuality education that we of the older generation had in our time often offered information about the biology of sexuality and nothing else. That can lead to a reaction. I want to qualify the reaction a little. We need, of course, much, much more than the biology, but biology is part of it and matters. But biology not as something that is abstracted from the way we live our actual lives in social and economic and cultural contexts. Human biology exists in a context of social relations. That's how we survive as a species. And our education needs to reflect that. So the biological side of sexuality education which is important, needs educationally to be integrated in the real social context in which our lives are lived. That means that sexuality education also means relationship education. That involves, of course, gender relations and all the other social dimensions that bear on the construction of emotional, personal, sexual relationships. We know that such relationships change with age. There's a library of research about the changing patterns of relationships in childhood and adolescence, from the familiar forms of play in early childhood, through the formation of peer groups, the transformation of peer groups, engagement with the adult economic world, and so on. And part of that development, that changing pattern of relationships, of course, is the development of what sociologists often call the sexual markets that appear in young people's lives in adolescence, where many adolescents, both boys and girls, become very much concerned with questions of their attractiveness, their capacity to form relationships with members of the so-called opposite sex, with eventually the formation of sexual relationships and the gaining of sexual pleasure. And this is also, part of the reality that sexual education must deal with, and should, I think, have no hesitation about drawing on the social sciences as well as the biological sciences for building appropriate curricula about these kinds of changes. And then this is where teaching can become genuinely difficult, emotionally difficult for teachers. Sexual education also must involve education for the problems that children are quite likely to encounter, or at least may encounter as they grow. Issues, for instance, of sexual coercion, date rape is not unknown in adolescence. Sexual abuse of young people by adults, most of which, of course, occurs, as we know, in families, not with strangers. And then there are the crises of development, the sexual crises about identity, about the early experience of sexuality, these two. So teachers need ways of handling these kinds of issues, not, as I've said, not necessarily emotionally easy for the teachers, but if they're understood to be regular and significant parts of the curriculum in a wide context of social education, then I think they will become easier for the teachers to handle and more readily understood by parents and communities when they do. Now, I remarked, and I think Maria Antonia also remarked about the emergence of political strategies, particularly on the right of politics, which use issues about sexuality to put pressure on marginalized groups and also on educators to cling to a narrow definition of what sexuality education can be. And if we're to get a good and thorough sexuality education as normal practice in the schools, we need to consider what teachers need to be able to do this. Some protection from political harassment, support from authorities in the education sector, support from unions, and from professional professional organizations in the, not just the industrial organizations, but also professional education, subject associations and the like, many of which can legitimately become involved in discussions of sexuality education curricula. And finally, it's a matter for teacher educators, and that's where I, in a way, speak from, since my final job in the university was in an education program very much involved in teacher education. And here we need good guidelines which draw on the intellectual resources I've mentioned. We need examples, case studies, documentation of good and successful practice. We need materials, not only for classrooms, but for teacher education itself. And we should remember that in teacher education, as well as in the school classroom, the learners are active. The learners are active agents. So trainee teachers during their education also have experience, resources, and interests which teacher educators need to build on to produce good educational effects. So what I'm saying is not very different from what I would say on many issues in education. The principles apply. There are specific issues and specific difficulties in sexuality education, but the broad principles of good, inclusive, and active education, I think, apply in this field too. I think in this project and in this conference, you have a great opportunity. I'm very glad to have been able to offer some contribution to it, and you have my heartfelt best wishes for your discussions from here on. So I will be quiet now, and I hope we do have a little bit of time left for questions and comments, and I'll be very pleased to answer questions if I can.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you have touched all the topics that we are going to talk later on. And if anybody has a question, you can write it in the chat, or if you want to talk, you can raise your hand and Estelle is going to open your micro. So we'll wait. Si alguien tiene una pregunta, la puede escribir en el chat, y si quiere hablar puede levantar la mano y Estelle les va a abrir el micro. Así que sí, if there is no question, or while we are waiting for some comment or question, I have two things to ask you. The first one is about the institution, because we are talking about schools and how children can have agency, but they are in the school, and the school is an institution, and it's not easy for them to have some agency. We have one girl who was 11 years old who told us that she wanted to receive this sex education at the school, but she didn't want to be forced to answer any question if she didn't want to. So she put on the table the feeling of being in an institution doing some kind of sex education where there is a power relationship. This is the first one about institution and the schools. And the other one is about when you talk about social justice and care, that I think that it's a very deep thought, because it's changing the way that we relate to each other. So it's thinking always in a caring relationship, not only in these sexual relationships, but I think in general, you talk about that. And I was thinking if you think that it could be possible, just to explain personal experiences of how adults have learned about sexuality in a context, in different contexts where sex education was not in the school, because I think that when you talk from your own perspective, you can create some more empathy. But it is an intimate question, socially constructed as intimate. So sometimes it's very difficult to talk from your intimacy, your fears, how you have learned about this human dimension. And I was thinking if it could be a way of create empathy and relationships through adults' own experiences and learnings about sexuality. And these are my two questions.
Sure. Okay, on the first question, pardon me, I think the young person who raised that issue was quite right. There are power relationships in schools. There is no doubt about that. The school is an expression of the state. Teachers have power over students in many ways. What students may not realize is that students also have power over the teachers. But all teachers know that. But there is an institutionalized hierarchy, plainly. There is a gender regime, as I would call it, in a school. So there are, accepted and normalized patterns of ways of enacting femininity and masculinity in most schools. There are normal ways of, organizing a class, the familiar geography of a classroom with the teacher out in front, the children sitting in rows in front of her or him. Materializes that power relationship in a way. So I would agree with the girl who raised that question, that it's a very real one. And if I were, facing a pupil who, did not want to answer questions in such a context, I wouldn't require her to. There is this is what I was saying about paying attention to the needs and readiness of the pupil. And if they are able to articulate, what they're prepared to do and not, then that is a good thing. We should, a teacher faced with that kind of statement, I think, would be advised not to push, not to demand something that is going to create difficulty for learning, but to spend some time, maybe not right immediately at that very moment, but trying to understand why that reaction came out, what is the difficulty there, and we know what some of those might be: embarrassment about what is, about being public, about what the issues that are often thought of as private, fear of being laughed at by other kids in the classroom, fear of saying things that will cause embarrassment for the family. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why a child might be hesitant. What I would suggest there is that we need to think about the way to normalize this a broader sexuality education for the children, to make it not an exceptional high anxiety experience or setting, and then allow over time within a school system, make this more, if you like, a more routine experience, so that those kinds of emotional barriers don't arise. On the second question, about how adults learn, and indeed about how I learned about sexuality, I want to mention two things. One, in my childhood, my parents, who were both teachers, both took a hand in teaching me and my sisters about sexuality. My mother was a biology teacher, so she took it on her as her job to teach us about the physiology of sexuality, about human reproduction, and the like. My father, who had become the headmaster of the school and then eventually went into academic teaching, taught me about the emotional side of sexual relationships. He actually taught me a bit about Freud, and encouraged me to read somewhat diversely about sexuality, so that through a perhaps unusual gender division of labor between my parents, I got both sides, both of the familiar sides of sexuality education in a way. This was in the 1950s, I might say. But I later learned from very different sources. And on one occasion, at the time when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was developing in the 1980s, I was involved in a research group which conducted research on gay men's sexuality in very close collaboration with community educators. And in that situation, I learned a lot about the educational needs of adults. Even experienced adults still had a lot to learn about sexuality. And we were doing the research that provided some of the data that fed into the work of community educators. So this is an area where lifelong learning applies. And we should not assume by any means that all of sexuality education ends with the school.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing this experience and your thoughts. We have some more questions, and Maria, I think that she wants to speak up.
I'm not hearing you.
María, ¿puedes hablar? A ver, probamos si puedes hablar.
Okay, she says that it was a mistake. No worries. And Devia Mahana from South Africa, she has a question in the chat. How do we turn around the unending narrative of childhood sexual innocence, which remains an obstruction to how we approach children and sexuality?
I think the crucial thing here is somehow to make the idea of childhood sexuality less threatening. I think that can only become a political issue rather than if you like, a simple psychological fact about children, but is made a political issue because it can be made to appear threatening to the good order, if you like, of society. And there, I think I'm a little baffled by that. I'm not sure how we can accomplish that. But a good part of it, I'm pretty sure, has to do with what I was trying to say right at the beginning of my talk. That is conveying the idea that sexuality is an important and wonderful part of human life. It's not the work of the devil. It's part of the creation, the capacity for sexual relationships, sexual pleasure. It's part of a good life, of good living, if you like, to use the South American expression, of our collective lives. We should not be afraid of it, and we should encourage people not to be afraid of sexual experience, sexual life, and for that matter, sexual diversity. That is partly a task for people like me, for researchers, to try to convey through writing, through mass communication, through storytellers, some of the wonder and possibility and joy of sexuality. But it's very appropriate to include that sense about sexuality in our work in schools too, so that for children too, it becomes unthreatening, an ordinary part, though a part that, because of its emotional and biological role in our lives, needs care and consideration and respect in handling. So I don't think we're on the wrong, we're working in the wrong direction in that, but we perhaps need to think of the larger agenda of cultural change that also needs to happen around sexuality, not just in the schools.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Ima Gonzalez from Barcelona. And she's asking how can introduce the perspective about ableism in sexual education.
I'm sorry, a perspective about?
Ableism, but I'm not sure.
Ableism, yeah.
Ableism. Okay, sorry.
Yes, I understand. Sure.
Okay.
So the idea there is that sexuality education, like other parts of the curriculum, should be fully inclusive of different forms of embodiment, should include people who have been classified as disabled in various ways, people who are sick as well as people who are well, people who might have in medical terms would be regarded as impairments, that they also have a full right to sexuality education, and their experience and needs have to be part of curriculum development and school practice. That's absolutely right. There is also a literature on that that can be drawn on in developing curricula and can be used in teacher education. So thank you for raising that point and making sure that that is part of our thinking about what needs to be done.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that there is no any other question. Yeah, one more. Diana Marre from Barcelona. What influence, if any, do you think the decision of the Convention on the Rights of the Child to set the age of adulthood at 18 has had at the consideration of childhood innocence?
I honestly don't know what that has done technically to change practice in, for instance, in the courts and in policing. I know that in the different jurisdictions have different notions about the age of adulthood, and that there are in quite a number of jurisdictions attempts to raise the age of adulthood and adult responsibility towards that mark, and I understand why that is important. Whether that is likely to change cultural assumptions about the nature of childhood, I don't know. What we face is the need not just to negatively criticize outdated notions about innocence and outdated understandings of transitions to adulthood, which in fact occur over considerable periods of time and along different paths for different groups of young people. But we also need to spread, and I guess this is a kind of task for public education, for collective public education. We also need to spread a more sophisticated and realistic understanding of what childhood is actually like. And that can sometimes be a bit confronting. I mean, not just about sexuality, but I mean, we need to acknowledge, for instance, the level of violence that occurs in peer groups often enough, only part of which would ever come to the attention of schools as through anti-bullying measures. So, there are tough things to learn if we're being realistic about childhood, as well as attractive things. And that, I guess, is, in a way, what we need to do is demythologize childhood, and the criticizing and overcoming the notions of sexual innocence of children is hopefully part of that demythologizing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question? I don't think so. I would like to thank again your presentation. You were able to be here. It's really a pleasure for us. And I will also would like to thank to Estelle Malgosa, who has organized everything and who has made it possible. So I think that we can close now this first session, and we have exactly 4 minutes for the next one. So thank you very much, RAEWYN. It has been a real pleasure. And I hope to see you soon here or somewhere else.
Well, I'm delighted to have been with you. Thank you very much too. Bye.
Thank you.